right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session at the Distributed SQL Summit Asia about how Union Bank of the Philippines, a leader in digital banking in the region, is changing the game in financial services by being one of the first banks to go completely cloud native. We're going to talk about how Union Bank is making this transformation happen. And here to talk about the company's mission, the motivation behind going cloud native, and also talking about tech strategy and innovation is the man leading the charge, Henry Aguda. Henry is the Senior Executive Vice President, Chief Technology and Operations Officer, Chief Transformation Officer of the Union Bank of the Philippines, and also Chairman of the Board of UBX Philippines, the FinTech venture studio of the bank. Henry, that's a lot of responsibility and a lot of titles. Welcome to DSS Asia.
Thank you, Sudha. Good morning to you and to Karthik and to everybody that's watching right now.
Good morning. And also with us, also joining us is Karthik Ranganathan, CTO and co-founder of Yugabyte. Karthik, do you want to just give us a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure. First off, thank you, Sudha, for having me. And thanks, Henry, for joining us. And good morning to everybody. Quick intro from my side, as Sudha was saying. I've been mostly on the technology side. At Yugabyte, I'm one of the co-founders and the CTO, having started building the database, the company, everything about 6 years ago. Before that, I was at Nutanix working on distributed storage, and Facebook before that, working on distributed databases. We built an open source databases like Apache Cassandra, Apache HBase, and we also managed a lot of these databases in production. Right? So we had a lot of data under management for what you would call cloud native applications. Right? So it's yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Karthik. And just to round out the introduction, my name is Sudha Srinivasan. I'm the VP of Strategy and Marketing at Yugabyte. Spent the past couple of decades in different roles in B2B tech. So we're going to talk about Union Bank's mission to become digital to the core, right? And we're going to talk about UBX's steady commitment to digital transformation for over a decade. But before we jump into those juicy topics, let's start with some background in the financial sector, right? What's happening? The last couple of years have been very interesting with news like Robinhood's IPO, and I just heard Stripe's IPO is upcoming. We have seen the rise of challenger banks in Europe. We have seen the disaggregation of banking functions, cryptocurrency, so many different trends changing the shape of financial services. So Henry, let me start with you. What are some of these fundamental shifts that you've seen going on in financial industry that are shaping your strategy today?
Well, right now, the biggest shift is moving into cryptocurrencies, I think. So first is cryptocurrencies. Even central banks are trying to launch their own digital coin. So you know how it is. When the central banks are themselves trying to launch a digital currency, it's going to be mainstream soon. And more than just changing the medium of exchange from paper to electronic transfer of journals of debits and credit, moving to a digital currency changes the efficiency of the financial sector. Suddenly, you're not just moving records of value, you're moving value. So I won't go into the details of how so many people have made so much money out of the fad or the trend. But as a bank, we look at it as a way of making the allocation of economic resources in our country more efficient. That, and of course, everybody's now jumping into digital payments. Everybody's digitizing the way they service their customers. We've seen the rise of the banking apps here in the Philippines, not just wallet, but banking apps themselves. Because in the Philippines, our regulation is such that if you have a digital wallet, you're capped at a certain amount. You can hold, on an average, a maximum of $10,000 on your wallet. But once you have a digital bank account, and from an app, you can transfer money at will, borrow money at will. Now that gives you a whole different dimension, especially if you can hold as much as you can on a bank account. So those two things, I mean, cryptocurrencies and the blockchain technology that comes with it, and the move to the super apps in banking. Those are the big trends that are now sweeping my country at this point.
Fantastic, Henry. And definitely, we've heard about this notion of unbanking the banked. And this was from another CIO where you talk about how the traditional concept of bank as this brick and mortar entity where everything kind of happens, front end to back end happens in the bank. is going away. Right now, you have this notion of apps in the front end, connecting to backs in the back end, API-based connections. That is definitely transforming a lot of things in financial services. Karthik, do you want to jump into some of the things that you've seen from working with financial services customers at Yugabyte?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of what Henry said, but from slightly a different perspective. That's all. Like just because of the data layer being the connection from a Yugabyte perspective, right? So, I mean, I'll take a few examples, right? Like we're working with a number of large banks, including the likes of, say, a Wells Fargo, or some of these fintech companies like Xignite. I mean, I'll just take those couple of examples, right? A huge digital initiative at Wells Fargo, right? There's a lot of modernization from their existing services going cloud native, going into public cloud. So there's a big focus on that side. So this is the rise of apps, right? As Henley so eloquently put it. And, you know, apps cover a lot of stuff, right? Including crypto and everything from a database perspective, at least, right? And the other big trend is just the sheer volume of data, right? I think no one probably exemplifies this better than Xignite. Xignite is one of Xignite's customers is incidentally Robinhood. And Robinhood is, I mean, Xignite provides B2B APIs for Robinhood to serve about stock exchanges and market data and so on. Right. And one of the things that Xignite went through was, you know, just the massive amounts of data. They just had a lot of stock symbols, a lot of tickers, commodities, a lot of exchanges that they had to onboard. So, and everybody's going through the same thing, right? Because customers want everything, want it all, and want it really quickly, and want it in a secure manner. So, you know, that's driving some of the innovation from that perspective as well.
That's perfect. And if we have some time, we're going to jump into security and privacy as well. Because Henry, I know from reading your bio that you've written about privacy, you've written about security threats, and so on. So that's going to be a hot topic for us to get into. But let's take a step back, right? UnionBank started digital transformation over a decade ago when the concept was still fairly new and probably not even fully understood, right? And I've heard you talk about the social mission behind your digital transformation efforts. So can you talk a little bit more about that and tell us what drove this investment when it was still very nascent?
Yeah, so our social mission is actually banking the unbanked or solving the financial inclusion problem in the Philippines. So dial it back 6 years ago, the unbanked is quite huge. The pandemic, fortunately or unfortunately, helped us bank the unbanked, because right now we have bank accounts where you can open bank accounts without an initial deposit. We call it light accounts, zero deposit accounts. This allows us now to have visibility of people out there who may or may not have money yet, but at least we now have the data points to figure out how to provide financial aid, whether it's through donation or through government augmentation. And, you know, just to add to what Karthik mentioned about the explosion of data and how it relates to our mission. So 5 years ago, if you look at the digital transaction compared to the non-digital transaction in our bank, only about 5% were digital. And we were doing close to about 300,000 transactions per year. That's per year. So which means those are the ones that we can track. 4 or 5 years later, that percentage has flipped. We now have 98% digital transactions compared to now just 2% non-digital transactions. And then the non-digital transactions are basically over the counter. We consider ATMs as non-digital, by the way. And it went from 98 to 2, not because we reduced the non-digital transactions, but the digital transactions exploded. Suddenly, we're not just doing 300,000 transactions per year, we're doing 30 million transactions. I think our latest number in terms of the API calls that we do is about a billion API calls per month. Now, talk about massive data tidal wave, right? So now we have the ability to bring in and store this information in, you know, it has to be in the cloud. Otherwise, you know, we'll be running acres and acres of data center space, which, you know, we're not in the data center real estate business, but that has provided us the oil to create our analytics, to target the requirements and the propensities that are out there in the market. So Our vision started out as solving and helping financial inclusion in our country. We used digital as a method. And when digital came in, the data explosion actually gave us a lot of insights and a lot of new ways of servicing our customers. That, I mean, if you Google UnionBank, we're anywhere from providing 3-minute loans, means you can get a loan within 3 minutes, to digital onboarding, meaning if you just take a selfie of yourself and an ID issued by a government agency, you don't have to go to our branches, you get an account. So all of that we've been able to do because of the infrastructure that we've been able to put together.
Awesome. And that's an excellent segue into where I wanted to take this conversation, right? Because you talk about the mission and you talk about what's driving this digital transformation. Now, can you share some of the priorities from a technology perspective, right? What are some of your focus areas of investment that allow you to deliver on this mission?
Yeah, well, right now, it has changed over time. But right now, our aim is to be 100% cloud. So we started with the usual cloud first policy, to now cloud only policy, to now 100% cloud. That's our priority now. At the beginning, we started with API, trying to make sure that all of our systems are interconnected via API calls, moving into an area where we can convert them into microservices. And now that most of them are there from a software application standpoint, it's an infrastructure play to move everything now to the cloud. We still have on-premise servers because we didn't want to immediately write down or write off assets that have been there. Ours have been a very prudent shift to new technology. We wanted to sweat out the assets before we move them. And I think 5 years is enough for us to depreciate fully all of the legacy systems we have. So it's a mass initiative now to move to the cloud. So that's our priority at this point. Now, why cloud? More than just being cool, like you guys, more than being cool and say that, hey, we're on the cloud, it actually gives us a lot of flexibility. It actually gives us a lot of infinite scalability abilities. In fact, if you rate the service availability of our app compared to our peers here in the country, ours is the highest in terms of service level. And I keep telling my agile teams, my dev team, but sometimes they get jealous when I spend a lot of time with the infra guys than with the dev. I tell them, you're only as fast as your infra, and your systems are only as stable as your infra. So our priority right now is to get that infra up in the cloud as quickly as possible.
Excellent, Henry. I mean, there was
really well said. Actually, one thing I just wanted to add is like we went through a very similar phase at Facebook. As we grew up, it was like, I think all transformation goes through a similar phase, right? So I distinctly remember there that the developers would keep writing more and more code, and then the infrastructure would barely be able to keep up, to a point where we were pretty sure that the site was going to fail every week, right? It happened every week. And our VP of engineering, pretty much the CTO of Facebook at that time, he used to joke, right? When they used to ask him, hey, why is this infra unstable? He's like, the problem is we write code. You stop writing code, everything will be fine. So I think, in other words, I think what he was saying is you have to let the infrastructure catch up, right? And once you catch up, then it's okay, right? As much as you want. So,
yeah. And Karthik, while you're kind of talking about that, what are some of let's look at the technology side of this equation, right? What are some of the big tech trends that you've seen that have kind of shaped the enterprise, right? And financial services is one piece of it, but in general, when you look at enterprise transformation that's been happening, what are some of the big tech trends?
Yeah. I think I can start from let me maybe take it a little historically, right, and then go to where we are right now, right? I think one of the great points that Henry made was that it's not about adopting cloud for the sake of adopting cloud, right? It's really a path to something, right? Like if you put the dotted line to what that something is, right? I mean, first we had the age of big data, right? Like you had to deal with a lot of data, but it's not important, the data itself. It's what you derive, the analytics, the insights from the data. Now we're entering a phase of transactional big data. So these are things that end users interact with. So you can't suddenly have it disappear or be down. Like it's not the result of crunching the data. It's also the data that's important underlying, right? So you have to have fast access to it. So that naturally gives rise to the need for services that can deal with large amounts of transactional data that can scale out like when needed. I mean, you can of course build an elaborately scaled out system, but it's going to cost you an arm and a leg, and you probably don't want to do that. So you want to scale it out on demand and bring it back in. So a lot of elasticity at the core. But how do you do this in a cost-effective manner, right? You do this by moving to cheaper hardware, to commodity hardware. That's what the cloud provides, and economies of scale, right? Cloud like pretty much handles thousands and thousands of enterprises, so it's far more subsidized for them to do the same thing at scale. So, but when you go here, you get failures, and when you have failures, you now have to ensure availability of services and data, right? So that becomes another theme. So in addition to scale, there's the availability of data. And then the other thing was, I don't know, back in the day, if you folks remember, I don't know how many of the audience remembers, but people were lucky to have 2 data centers. You wouldn't have more than 2. If you were really sophisticated, you had 2. If you were not sophisticated, well, you didn't have 2. That's about it, right? So now there's 200 out there, right? And so there's no reason not to be able to move data closer to end users, right? And some of these things that Henry talks about, right? Like hey, this is going to be the fastest service, the most uptime, like all of this matters in the long run, because if you're not doing it, somebody else is doing it, and somebody else will disrupt you if you're not the first to do it, right? So ability to accommodate scale, give a low latency, all of that becomes important. Now, let's say you get past all of that, right? Like then what happens? So your infrastructure is kind of built cloud native, so you're ready to take on scale and all of this. Well, then it becomes a game of how quickly can your developers build and release features into production while still maintaining the infrastructure bar, but also the application quality, the service quality, right? So this gets you into a stage of fast application building and CI/CD pipelines and all of that stuff. So it's an interesting journey, right? And so like I can draw my parallel analogy from the history of Facebook, how I saw that develop, and we went from weekly pushes to production to multiple times a day, right? That was the final leg of the journey. But there had to be a lot of things that had to work its way in terms of technology to reach that point.
Great point, Karthik. I think the sum of what both Henry and you said was, at the end of the day, technology has to be in service of business priorities. And business priorities are primarily 3 things, right? Bringing new services to market faster, at lower cost, and lower risk, right? Any technology that can do that for you is the technology that you embrace. And I think cloud has proven to be an enabler if done the right way, if used the right way, and if you kind of use the right mindset to doing it. Henry, I'm going to very briefly touch on one thing because you mentioned it. Now, you said, I was going to ask you if you consider UBX a born in the cloud company. And it sounds like you actually did have apps that you had, running in data centers. And then you also had some greenfield. How much of what you have today is greenfield born in the cloud versus apps that you're bringing over from, pre-cloud days?
Well, right now, everything new is born in the cloud. So we're a big fan of Postgre. And extensibility is my mantra. Extensibility, extensibility, extensibility. Build a system that people cannot connect to easily and gracefully, then it won't scale. But if you build a system where it's API rich, it's extensible. At the same time, the database is native to geolocation, redundancy, failure proof, then there you go, you have it. So most of our systems that are new are being built on that tone. The only remaining legacy system that we have that's legacy is basically our CASA. Now, our CASA is an old system that we will now start porting to the cloud. And we will start, so you understand that we have to work with the system and the application provider to recreate their system into, well, it's not native, so we'll port it to the cloud. So that's the only thing that's remaining that's really not cloud native, so to speak. But our CIO promised within the end of the year that would be ported out already. But everything new, everything we're building, Postgre all the way.
Very cool. Now, over the past decade, something that we've all seen is that there's a lot of focus on app modernization, microservices. But what about the data layer, right? Do you see a need for innovation in the data tier? And if so, what are some of the new use cases, new architectures that you're seeing?
Well, we're a big fan. Well, before we get into the data layer, we do have a very strong data governance infrastructure. And I think a lot of people lose sight of the fact that you can have the best data tech out there, but if you're not organized around it, you won't maximize it. So in our case, we make sure that all extraction points from all major systems are through API. No Excel transport, no batch. I hate batch. So, I mean, I see a batch transfer out there, I have to outflow it. And then we pump it to our AI engine. And we do have a strong organization with AI experts. Last count we have 7 PhDs who are putting together algorithms. So those are the ones that maximize whatever we have with all the gazillion data points that we currently have. From a DB standpoint, I guess that's the reason why I'm looking forward to an experiment that we will soon do with Karthik and team. We want to recreate our rural banks, 7 of them, and move them up to a more, should I say, modernized SQL DB infrastructure that allows us better ingestion of information.
Got it. No, and we'll look forward to that the collaboration there, because this is definitely a very fascinating use case, right? In general, edge architectures are on the rise, and a lot of what you're talking about is essentially kind of that distributed edge architecture. Karthik, same question to you. If we've been talking a lot about app modernization, and our CEO Bill Cook kind of led the charge there with what he was doing at Pivotal. But database modernization and database transformation is kind of now coming into its own. Can you tell us a bit about what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'll go at it from maybe a slightly different perspective, right, from what Henry said, because he covered his side really well. So one way to think about this is, for the obvious reasons we have talked about so far, the public cloud is becoming the infrastructure of choice, right? Like so like people want to adopt it. People will get value from adopting it, and a lot of value from that, right? But what does it really do? If you really peel everything apart and you really look at it, right? It only does a couple of things, and maybe 3 things. Well, the first one is it gives access to compute instantaneously, right? For those of you that know how it worked back in the day, the hardest thing to do was to procure machines, rack and stack them, and have them ready to go, right? That would take you, I don't know, 9 months to 1 year, right? If you really wanted a reasonable number of machines. If you were lucky, you'd get it in 6 months. Well, you can actually order your machines and then go build an app. Right? It wouldn't do a lot in 6 months to 9 months, right? But today, with public cloud, that has shifted to getting these compute in seconds, right? So that means you can get compute anytime you want it. And because of the laws of economies of scale, once again, that you have machines always available. There's no dearth of them. So you just fire an API, and a few minutes later, you have as many machines as you need. So the bottleneck clearly has moved away from procuring machines. The bottleneck is now how quickly can you build and deliver? How quickly can you build stable infra? It's something else, right? Now, when you look at the stable infra, what that means is you should be able to accommodate bursty like scale, right? Like scale on demand. And these machines are done in a particular type of architecture with commodity machines. So that infrastructure should be able to handle running on these noisy neighbors and VMs type infrastructure with failures of zones and regions. So it should be able to accommodate that substrate, right? And the third thing is, well, you have tons of regions, all of which look the same. They're cookie cutter. So, making everything DevOps based and making everything reproducible through code becomes very important, because you can then onboard as many regions as you want and leverage the power of this infrastructure to do the next layer. So these are some of the fundamental fabrics, right? And this is it's not any surprise so far, right? So the thing, just like Henry said, one of the things that's growing very fast is the adoption of Postgres, because it is really flexible and it is really extensible, right, as a database, and it's really open too. So really no lock-in, right? But Postgres was built way before, right, 30, 40 years ago, not really built for this type of an infrastructure, right? So that's where, I think our hypothesis at Yugabyte DB when building the database is that, build a database that pretty much has everything in Postgres to make it as open, as extensible, as flexible, but bring it to this modern compute fabric, modern infrastructure fabric. So you can quickly onboard applications and build it, and people know how to get started quickly. People know where this is headed, and so on and so forth. So that's really, I'd say, the way to think about it. Oh, that and the fact that there's even more scale going on. And so that brings geo-distribution and scale. All of these things bring with it unique asks, right, at the database layer, the data layer. And so that makes it really interesting and fun.
Yeah, and one of the topics that you touched on was resilience, right? And so let me ask this question to Henry. Henry, Philippines is in the ring of fire, right? I mean, that sounds pretty ominous. So disaster recovery should always be kind of in the back of your mind. So how do you think, by the way, I'm saying that sitting in the
I was
Bay
about to say,
Area,
it says the folk who are sitting in the earthquake zone, but anyway.
live earthquake zone. But so we all have to think about disasters and plan for disaster recovery. So how do you think about DR in this situation?
Yeah, so it's a nice thing you mentioned about Postgre, and it started as a monolithic thing, and that's why we need to, as good as it is, we need to make it extensible and more resilient. And the reason for that is in the Philippines, where we have anywhere from earthquake to civil unrest, sometimes to tidal waves. So we're also prone because we have the Atlantic on the left and the Pacific on the right. And to make things more complicated, there's the concept of deglobalization because of recent events, right? So before, the answer was, okay, let's all put it on the cloud, public cloud. Anything that happens in the Philippines, I mean, at least your information's out there. But then with deglobalization, not only do you just trust that it's in the cloud, you have to be able to also have the diversity to have it in country as well. So imagine how complex that is. And a database that's able to work well in a hybrid scenario is something that we really must have. So to answer your question, I think to answer resiliency, you need to have diversity. And diversity comes from, not only having it on a public cloud that's outside of your jurisdiction, but also having it on a cloud infrastructure that can also be on site, can also be public, but in country. And to make matters more complicated, your system has to run simultaneously, consistently across all of them. So that's our concept of resiliency. Resiliency in rich, diversified environment.
Very, very interesting. I mean, in general, redundancy and diversity is what you're talking about, right? Actually having choice of where you deploy it, how you deploy it, and how you run it. So we have time for exactly one last question because it's been, as I kind of expected, time flew. So there's an increased focus on security, privacy, data sovereignty, regulatory compliance, and so on. So, quick 30 seconds each. What are your thoughts on the matter? And do you think, how are you kind of planning for this? How is this impacting your strategy?
Yeah, so if I'm going to go first, my solution for that is use secure API. So an extensible system that's not secure is just a problem waiting to happen. So in our case, every data point extracted must go through a secure API layer. And aside from that, I guess it's vigilance all around. It's not enough that you can diversify your infrastructure. You should have to have the framework to be able to monitor everything that goes around it. So it's a critical concern for us being in the financial sector. But it's something that technology we've seen has been able to solve it for as long as we have an integrated way of putting them together with security in mind.
Thank you so much, Henry. And Karthik, any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, in terms of security, I think what we're seeing is that, in terms of cloud, right, where specifically everything that we talked about, Henry's previous answer, right, like diversity and redundancy and all of that, right, it increases your exposure, right? That's the bottom line of it. Your data was in one place, now it's in 5 places. That's just the nature of the beast. And you have to have data in 5 places. There's a very good reason for that. But, well, now you have to deal with making 5 places secure, right? So, what we've been focusing on a lot, right, as a database builder is to really enable as many SLAs and as many ways to express security as possible at the data layer, right? So this includes, regulatory compliance where you have to keep data local. Like, I know it's not direct security, but it is in some sense, right? It's compliance with the laws of the country that keep it local, and giving fine-grained control to be able to do this at a table level, at a row level, like based auto inference based on column, auto inference based on where you're accessing data from, all of that, all the way to very fine-grained ability to encrypt data at the column level, the table level, the database level, with key rotations, all of that at rest, in flight, so a rich variety of that. And the third dimension is obviously allowing that in the application itself, right? Like giving finer role-based access controls and so on and so forth, right? And I don't know, I personally believe we're just scratching the surface, because there's a lot of these intercombinations that get interesting. How do you give role-based access based on geographic location, for example, right? Is one example. Or similarly, more and more. So there's a lot of interesting innovation waiting to happen. There's also types of encryption where you can ensure that neither the cloud provider, nor the database managed service vendor, nor nobody is able to actually access the data by virtue of encryption. Yet you're able to give all of the power of a database, right? Like homomorphic encryption for range queries and comparisons and all of that type of stuff. So this is a pretty fascinating area. A lot of interesting stuff going on.
Lots of innovation for sure. So Henry, Karthik, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. We covered a lot of very interesting topics, and I hope everyone who joined the call, hope you enjoyed it. Look forward to hearing more from both of you as we continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Bye.
guys.